at least know somebody in one of those two corporations if you really want
I
a
don't.
process technology job. Otherwise, you're going to be an equipment operator.
Well, that could happen.
Continuing on with the first part of this evening, since I didn't finish yet, the next individual, theory of knowledge, we skip over 1,000 years and we go to St. Augustine. And what you have in the text from St. Augustine is the reply to the skeptic. Did everybody read it? It's kind of important. Yes, you remember the reply to the skeptic? It's kind of short, but I'll read it just in case.
Is this the skeptic and archetype form?
So, who were the skeptics? Oh, and something I didn't mention was, of course, we get the concept of the writing tablet from Aristotle's piece. And you've probably heard of the tabula rasa, the blank slate.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you know that idea. Before we have experience, we've got basically a blank slate. And then experience writes on the tablet. Okay, but Augustine is replying to skeptics. There were skeptics in the academy. So the Platonic, Plato creates an academy. The academy was actually a park in Athens donated by a man named Academus. So the park has his name on it, basically. I think there's some other variants on how that got there, but that seems to me the most likely case of how that works. The academy is still there as far as I know. The last pictures I saw, though, shows it to be not very well kept up. The gate was there, and there was graffiti all over it. So
That's shameful. That's really shameful.
in any case, it was just a park.
That depends on the graffiti. No, I'm actually more serious than you might think. I mean, one of the things that's strange that you find in the archaeological world is sometimes the graffiti's working on the wall. It's on. It's indicative of it.
Mm. Well,
if it's old enough, it may have worth.
and I was just looking at it through Google Earth, so whatever. However, Augustine, 1,000+ years later, is replying to the skeptics, and you can only assume what kinds of things he was thinking of as we're reading this. This short passage, it's not a short passage in the original. Pardon? I'm on page...
Not page 16.
15, 16 it is, yes.
Yeah, it is.
It doesn't say 16 there, you have to calculate. I'm glad your math skills are good. Okay, so possibility of deception. Are you deceived? Can you be deceived? Clearest contemporary comparison of this idea is the movie The Matrix. Is everybody familiar with The Matrix? Everybody thinks they're alive and living in a modern urban environment, but it's a lie. They're actually all basically just asleep in a vat of Jell-O.
You just really enjoy ruining movies for everyone,
running
don't
the
you?
batteries or whatever for the right, you know. I got red pill, blue pill. Neo, gets the resurrection thing, etc. The question is, gee, do you want to live life in that dream, or do you want to be in this miserable environment?
One of the things that I found most interesting about that from the original movie was actually the guy, I don't remember his name, Cyrus maybe or something like that, but he was the guy who was traitor to the crew because he wanted to go back into the fake world.
He'd
because
rather
that was
be
more
there.
pleasant.
Yeah. That's
So
where I'd go.
that brings up some really interesting
I'd stay there.
ideas too. But then since you're into ruining movies, in the last Matrix they find out that he's not really outside the Matrix anyways. Even him being an exception to the Matrix is itself part of the Matrix.
He's getting even ruining movies for me.
There you
I
go.
I never could watch even the second one. What a Matrix regurgitated.
There's also some interesting. There's been some interesting, stuff written about him as a messianic figure and as him being stuck in the subway station as purgatory and so forth. Have you looked into any of that?
My granny always used to call it Turkey, which actually made a lot more sense to me because we didn't speak Italian.
Okay. So know that.
Yeah, you should read. I'm just thinking about the argument I once. I'm just thinking about an argument I once read about. Remember the main character is like Clockwork Orange being argued as being a Christ character, so being a Messiah as well, which is it's twisted, but there's actually logic in that. Yeah. No.
Okay, so let's go to the discussion. So this is Augustine, and his answer to the skeptics: "If I am deceived, I am." Right? How do you know you really exist? You might be just being deceived. He says, "For we both are, and know that we are, and delight in our being and our knowledge of it. Moreover, in these three things no true seeming illusion disturbs us, for we do not come into contact with these by some bodily sense, as we perceive the things outside of us, colors by seeing, sounds by hearing, smells by smelling, tastes by tasting, hard and soft objects by touching. Of all which sensible objects it is the images resembling them, but not themselves, which we perceive in the mind and hold in the memory, and which excite us to desire the objects, but without any delusive representation of images or phantasms, I am most certain that I am, and that I know and delight in this. In respect of these truths, I am not at all afraid of the arguments of the academicians, who say, what if you are deceived? For if I am deceived, I am. For he who is not cannot be deceived, and if I am deceived, by this same token I am. And since I am, if I am deceived, how am I deceived in believing that I am? For it is certain that I am, if I am deceived. Since, therefore, I, the person deceived, should be, even if I were deceived, certainly I am not deceived in this knowledge that I am. And consequently, neither am I deceived in knowing that I know, for as I know that I am, so I know also this, and that I know. And in the longer piece that this is from, he also points out, and I love it. So there's a trinity of experience here, that I know, I know that I know, and I love knowing that I know. So in a sense, he's comparing us not in a realistic sense, but to the Trinity. So in a way, it also helps explain the concept of the Trinity in that particular section. But so that's fun. Notice that there are some interesting problems with Augustine. He's not an Aristotelian. So while it seems to absolutely make sense that Aristotle trumps, oh, I shouldn't have said that. Aristotle beats Plato, but Aristotle was a friend, a supporter of his student, Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was a Macedonian, not a Greek, and when Alexander the Great died, the Greeks were mad at everybody that was connected with him, including Aristotle, so Aristotle hot-footed it out of Athens to save Athens from sinning twice against philosophy, because they had killed Socrates. So he headed out, and his philosophy didn't really blossom very well either, and Plato really was still the main philosophy. And so now when we see the Christian period, notice that Plato is still pretty much the system that they believed was the way the universe was, instead of Aristotle. Aristotle will come back after the Crusades, actually, and that's when the church will realize it has to adapt to Aristotle, and so they end up going through about a 200-year change, and that's when Aquinas becomes significant, because Aquinas is the one that resolves the conflict between Plato and Aristotle. And as they say, he out-trumps Plato, or he out-Plato's Plato, and he out-Aristotle's Aristotle, because he combines the two of them in a way that, by the way, we all pretty much accept today. So it's kind of common sense for us. So we're all followers of Aquinas, and of course incorporating Augustine as well. We don't lose these, kind of accumulate stuff as we go. But so René Descartes. So we move on to René Descartes now. Doubt and uncertainty. And what's nice about the way Stan has put this book together, you've got Augustine's paragraph here, and then you've got Descartes doing the same thing in 6 meditations, right? And so you end up then with Cartesian doubt. By the way, Descartes is one of those that I have trouble with because his name literally means of the paper or of the map. And the main thing he did when he was alive was, that he was famous for in his own day, was the Cartesian coordinate system, analytic geometry, because he was looking at a fly up on the wall.
I want to tell you that I'm not a dualist. Effective way of doing things economically, because of the control that it exerted over society, was going to start to become the model that many developing countries would look to. And so my thought about it is this: if we understand this trend, if we project this trend as going to make everybody want to be more like China, want to construct social and political regimes in which what really flourishes is not the individual, is not the community, is not that noisy debate that a society has with itself, but the possibility of growing wealthier and increasing the bottom line on the GDP. Somehow or other, capitalism, and you know, I'm not myself, despite the hairstyle, all that against capitalism. I mean, I do think that the
Really has good hair.
shoestrings and chewing gum and what have you do best if left to the market. But at the same time, we have to really be conscious about
He's
the
on my list,
sorts
by
of
the way.
forces that
We
might
have a
diminish
picture,
our prospects of being
term paper topic.
free as
One of the
individuals
philosophers
to make
said.
decisions of a very important kind about how we live and how our societies might be. And what I see with the marriage now emerging in the East, in China, of capitalism, state capitalism, but capitalism also on an individual basis, with a kind of political
Back a
regime
little too
which is
early,
intolerant of
That's kind of
argument,
fashionable.
dispute and change. That the marriage of these two seeming opposites
You have to
is going
watch
to
the
create
earlier
a world
part.
which might not be
Talking about
so comfortable a world after
he's
all.
talking
for those
about
of us
his
who care
book,
about the values that we do care about. So I just wanted to ring a
The
little
Nature
bell,
of Things or something.
alert people to
and
the
one of the
possibility
chapters
to make
is
people
on
think
China,
about these things.
and one of
And
them
you
is
in
on
Australia,
mind.
I think, are at the vanguard of being able to think
And
about
that's
these
where
things,
I think
because
he
the
talks about
influence
Descartes.
of China, the Chinese economy on the Australian economy, the presence of China, the fact that with the coming agreement between your government and China,
He's in Australia
you might see
also.
even bigger
Just-
presence
I don't know if
of
you've
the
watched this
Chinese
one.
economy in the Australian economy. You have to look at Africa and one or two other places where very large numbers of Chinese technicians and labourers and others have gone into those countries to build infrastructure or build factories or to contribute to the
believe he was
development of
born in
technology
Africa.
there. And to see how
Some of his
very far
biographies.
the Chinese reach is now. And that is a good thing. We live in a global community now, and naturally enough we're going to be interpenetrating
I
one
like
country
his
and
anecdote
another,
about
one
Descartes.
area of the world and another. But we want to be able to do it in ways where important values, especially those that affect individuals, are preserved. In China itself, in mainland China, the expression which is used about going into business is xiahai, which literally means to dive into the sea. But in mainland China, it means to go into business. In Hong Kong, the same expression in Cantonese means to go into prostitution. So I leave you with that thought. Perhaps another final thought on the Chinese question, and that is that because of this increasing influence that China has in our world, we do well to learn more about it. The poetry of China, its literature, its philosophical traditions, its history are really wonderful. One can relish the prospect of knowing much more about that, and we should know more about that. And we should also learn a bit of Mandarin, all of us, at very least, so that we can say, I surrender. Well, what I've suggested there is that we should think about China, we should think about the future and the future role of China. And of course, thinking is something that requires a brain. Notice that if anybody hits you on the head hard enough with an ice pick, as happened to poor old Trotsky, that not a lot of thinking follows. So it's evident that the brain has something to do with thinking, and indeed, one of the most exciting things in our world today is the very, very rapid development of understanding of the brain in neuroscience. And this is largely a function of the fact that we've developed technologies now, and in particular, the functional MRI, that's magnetic resonance imaging technology, which enables us to watch brain activity in real time, to see which structures of the brain activate when certain sorts of tasks or challenges are offered to the individual whose brain it is. Now, most of the people who've been examined are university students. They're known as the lab rats of neurology, because they earn a few dollars by getting stuck into an MRI scanner. And of course, one does wonder whether university students are representative of humanity at large. I know them very well, so I sometimes have my doubts, despite being very fond of them all. But they have been subjected to a large number of examinations of different sorts of explorations of the psychological events that could be associated with the physical events observable in the brain by MRI scanning. And this has advanced our knowledge of brain activity, brain structure, hugely. And we are now, I think, at an early stage of really in-depth understanding of the brain. And it's an exciting time, therefore, for us as human beings, because one of the frontiers of our understanding being pushed out a little bit more every time an experiment of this kind is conducted. At the moment, there are some alarming suggestions coming out of brain research, and that is that, you know, the great metaphysical debate about free will and determinism, one of the very, very hardest, knottiest problems in metaphysics indeed, and it looks as though the argument is being nudged in one direction rather than the other direction. The problem is this: we think of ourselves as beings capable of making choices, of beings who should be held responsible for what we do, praised or blamed for the choices that we make. And yet, on the other hand, we think of ourselves as part of nature. Nature is a causal realm. Everything that happens in nature is caused by an antecedent state of affairs. So that if you thought of nature in an entirely causal way, then your presence here tonight at the Athenaeum in Melbourne was written in the stars billions of years ago. So which is it? Are you free? Do you choose? Are you responsible, morally and otherwise? Or are we just massively and systematically in error about that fact? And is it the case that actually, as prisoners of the causal system, what we do is always determined? Well, a lot of brain research seems to suggest the latter. Because when you're looking at a person's brain and you give them a choice, ask them to press the red button or the blue button, they've got to make up their mind. It looks as though the brain makes up the mind before the person does, before you know what the choice is. And that does seem to present us with this slightly alarming prospect that determinism is true, that we don't have free will. Is that right? Well, now I should tell you this, that even if you repudiate the kinds of objections that people make to brain research, one of the major objections is this. You remember that back in the 19th century, people were rather keen for a time on phrenology. This was feeling the bumps on people's heads. It's quite nice to have your bumps felt, you know, head massage, quite nice. Where people feel the bumps on your head and say, ooh, you're very imaginative, or oh dear, you've got criminal tendencies. This depends upon where the bumps are on your skull. Well, the point is sometimes made that because what MRI scanning shows is activation of very large structures, relatively speaking, in the brain, and the brain is a massively complex organ, so that if you got down and down and down to the cellular level and the molecular level, you would have a complexity which is unimaginable even from the point of view of MRI scanning. So all that the MRI does really, says the critic, is to replicate in a very expensive way phrenology, because it's just looking at bumps on the brain rather than bumps on the skull. So how could it really be telling us something about the brain? Well, I think that skepticism goes a bit too far. And I really do think that a great deal of what MRI scanning has shown us is really very valuable indeed. But does it really address the question that we're interested in having answered? Does examination of the brain tell us as much as we would like to know about the mind? Now, again, those of you, because I know you were all reading René Descartes in the bath last night, so you will remember Meditation 2, where he says, what am I? I'm a thinking thing. The essence of me is that I'm thought, I'm mental stuff. I can doubt that I have a body. And therefore, mind and body are not the same thing. Mind and body are separate. Of course, there was a problem about how they relate to one another, but he bequeathed to the modern debate in science and in philosophy this problem about the nature of mental phenomena relative to physical phenomena. After all, physical things tend to have a location in space. They tend to have a weight or a smell or a colour, a lot of physical properties, but thoughts don't have those properties. A thought doesn't weigh anything. It doesn't have a colour like pink or beige, and certainly doesn't seem to have a very precise spatial location, despite what MRI scanning shows us, because you can't say, well, the thought of my mother is just behind my left ear. So it looks as though mental and physical phenomena are very different. And this view that they are different is called dualism, and owes itself to Descartes. I should tell you a little anecdote about that. You know, Descartes was a very little fellow and a very, very proud man. He was very proud of himself and thought later on in his life that he should really be given a title and a pension by the king, in acknowledgement of the contributions he had made to philosophy. But unfortunately, France, just at the time he was thinking this, France went through one of its periodic revolutions. The French always have revolutions. So there was no chance of that. He was invited to go to Sweden by the Queen of Sweden, Queen Christina. He took a long time thinking about this, and when he finally turned up in Sweden, she had forgotten that she had invited him. And she was a woman of enthusiasms which came and went rather rapidly, and by the time he did turn up, she'd forgotten that she'd been enthusiastic about philosophy. So she said to him, oh, Monsieur Descartes, well, how nice of you to turn up. Will you write us a play? Which he'd never done before and didn't want to do. So he very reluctantly wrote a play, a very bad one, and the Swedes loved it. And they said to him, we want another one. And this time, could we have a shepherd and a shepherdess and an escape from a window? And he said, no, I'm off back. I'm not staying here. So reluctantly, Queen Christina agreed to have some philosophy tutorials with him, because he wanted to tell her his philosophical views. Now, she'd heard that he liked to lie in bed until noon every day. It's the fact that he did so, by the way, which has caused most of us such suffering at school when we had to learn geometry, because one day he was lying in bed, he saw a fly crawling on the ceiling, and he recognized that if he treated the two walls at right angles to one another as axes of a graph, he could plot the position of the fly with just two numbers anywhere on the ceiling. Hence our agonies over Cartesian coordinate geometry. Well, she thought she would play a bit of a trick on him. She made him give her tutorials at 5 o'clock in the morning in her unheated library in her castle. And what a trick it was, because he caught a chill, it became bronchitis, it turned into pneumonia, and he died. So she was very, very upset to have killed the most famous philosopher in Europe. And she was going to build him a great mausoleum, but she forgot about that pretty soon too. So he was buried in unconsecrated ground, and 17 years after his death, his body was exhumed to be taken back to Paris. And on the way, somebody pinched his head. Now, this is a strange thing, and people are always interested in the heads of geniuses. You know, Einstein's brain is in a vat, and people go and peer at it in the hope of understanding relativity. I don't know what it is they can expect to see. But this curiosity is kind of general one in human nature. So somebody pinched Descartes' head. And today, his body lies in the church of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, opposite the Domingo Café, and his head is in the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. So in death, the mind-body problem is I want to tell you that I'm not a dualist. I don't agree with Descartes. I don't think that minds are different from bodies. I don't think you get mind unless you have a brain. So I'm not a dualist. But I don't think that you're going to learn everything that we want to learn about minds just by looking at brains.
So I think he's good. By the way, the book that he wrote on Descartes. He's written lots of books, as you can imagine. He's founded a new school in London, also called the New School of the Humanities, and everyone's mad at him for it because he made the school pay as you go. So every student that gets accepted has to pay full price. So it's a very expensive university. Plus, they're elitist, so you have to take tests and only geniuses get in. So it's clearly an elitist that's catering to just the elite with lots of money, etc. So everybody thinks that's terrible. Of course, it's thriving because all the elite with money want to go. So that's kind of interesting. But this book argues that Descartes was a spy for the Jesuits, and that's pretty cool. I find that fascinating. So if you pick him as your philosopher, you might find him. So some things, though, about Descartes' dualism. That's the tradition, that Descartes is a mind-body dualist. The idea being that you can, in the meditations, you can prove that I, as a thinking substance, exists. So the res cogitans, thinking thing, exists. That's the cogito, right? I think, therefore I am. Everyone thinks that's famous, right? But then how does that give us knowledge? That's the next question, and that's not sufficient because from what he argues, that still doesn't give us grounds for thinking that the body gives us good information because it's still perspective, it's still subject to change depending on the lighting, the hot and cold wax, you know, it's hard and soft, etc. So what's the next step? And his next step is to argue that I have a concept of a perfect being, God, in my mind. And any effect has to be caused by something, and the cause has to be greater than the effect. And so therefore, the only way that I could have a concept of a perfect being in my mind is that a perfect being caused it there. And so therefore, God exists. So it's his version of the ontological argument. There's actually two in the Meditations. And I think you agree that you can see that it's considered a very weak version of the ontological argument. The St. Anselm's version, and Kurt Gödel gives us an updated mathematical version of it. That definitely seems to be much more intriguing, because even David Hume will kind of destroy this by pointing out that cause and effect is not a necessary connection, so that there's no necessary connection between a perfect God and my concept of a perfect God in my head. So that's kind of interesting. But for Descartes, that was the next step, because since he felt he had proved that God exists and God is perfect, God is not a liar, he's not an evil deceiver. So it's not the Matrix. Instead, this is what we can really believe it is, because God wouldn't lie to us. And so I can believe anything that's clar et distinct, he says, clear and distinct. And what does he mean by that? Mathematics. So what you can trust as knowledge is mathematics. That sort of still sticks with us, because notice no one argues over mathematics. Scientific theories, well, we're always waiting for the next improved theory. But with mathematics, 2 + 2 = 4. We don't really argue over that. You know, if you come home from school and you say to your mom, 2 + 2 = 5, Mom says, no, 2 + 2 = 4. But you being male, you want to torment your mother, so you say, aha, 2 + 2 = 5. And Mom goes, no, 2 + 2 = 4. And you learn you can't mess with math, right? There's no fudge factor there. Yes.
Did you
John?
give us a couple of quiz questions? You said one in the first hour and one in the second.
I did not, but
Well, yeah, but he gave us 4 last time.
but I'll give you 7 today. No.
You also did say in the syllabus that not every class will have quiz questions.
Well, that's because occasionally I've discovered I've forgotten.
Like I said, last time he gave us.
But
Just being
Jonathan just
helpful.
reminded me, so that's terrific.
I hate you.
So
Seriously, what were you
So,
thinking?
so here's,
Seriously,
so
what
let
were
me
you thinking?
finish this argument, because Descartes is living in a very volatile situation. I mean, he moves to the Netherlands, and what's cool about that is
Moved to Sweden.
well, yeah,
Or Denmark.
yeah, but before that,
Oh, okay.
before that. So he's in. So this is a Rembrandt painting that's called the Anatomy Lesson, and this is Dr. Tulip, who's explaining parts of the body to this group of men. And yes, by the way, Dr. Tulip is the one who started the tulip craze. Why there's still, he's the tulip, and then tulips. Yes. The flowers.
Okay.
I mean, he didn't
Collins
invent tulips,
famous
but
poem.
the tulip has their name from his fondness for them, or whatever. So but it's a Rembrandt painting. Rembrandt didn't paint them all in situ, right? They came to his painting studio, and he painted each of them individually into that spot. But the neat thing about this painting is Descartes was in the audience, and it was a dinner theater, so they had lunch while they were watching him. And this body was fresh; it had just been hung that day, and Dr. Tulip had paid the executioner for it. So as soon as he made sure the body was completely dead, put it in a wagon and took it to his parlor for this show and tell that occurred that evening. And we actually know stuff about this guy. He had been punished before, and it didn't take. And in fact, Rembrandt had to make up this arm because the guy had already had that arm chopped off for a previous offense. And so just all kinds of interesting stuff. But Descartes was interested in how the body worked, and in fact gives us this picture. That's color. I know he didn't publish that in color. But Descartes discovered the pineal gland and argues that the pineal gland is the place in the brain where the mind and the body interact. So there's because the mind is invisible and abstract like the soul, right? And yet the belief was that it's so that my body is communicating to my soul, my mind, right? My mind is communicating to the body, and the place where this kind of communications takes place, Descartes hypothesized, was the pineal gland, because it was right in the middle of the brain. And so that tells you that he was digging into bodies and looking for things, because he found this, right? Which also is probably why he moved every 3 months, because the house started to smell. Sorry. And by the way, I think it was illegal. You could pay people to go out and dig up bodies and bring them to you so that you could experiment on them and stuff. But, you know,
That's proper
Bring
channels
out
sometimes.
the church frowned on it, you know, because it's disrespectful to the soul, you know. Besides, the church thought that at the resurrection you needed your body so God could bring you back, etc.
If he's really God, he doesn't need the body. To just make a new one.
Well, but you're making it more difficult for God. You know, he's got to go shopping around for parts, and look at all those bodies he's got to bring back all at once. You know, that's a job. You know? Okay, so
Did he really? He thought it was just because it was in the middle. I'm curious.
well, he's clearly wrong, and this creates the problem.
But that's where you dream from instead. The pineal gland is where.
What's interesting today is they've discovered, you know, when I was a kid and adult, we were told, you know, don't hurt your head because, you know, you get the brain cells only once, you know, and after, you know, you grow your brain, you can't replace it, so if you smash it and stuff, you're just destroying cells, right? Well, now we know that we have cells coming out of the pineal gland, stem cells, that come out of the middle and head off into space, because it's like no roads or anything, and they just take off. And when one of your brain cells dies, which they do fairly regularly, the new cell arrives just in time and has become one of the 4 types of brain cells to replace exactly that cell. And that's just absolutely amazing to me, because the one guy described it as taking off from the Earth in a spaceship and heading off into the universe and arriving at the right star exactly at the right time to replace the brain cell that's just died.
Well, how can we possibly have brain damage then if it's sending stem cells out to replace brain cells that died?
It only works at a certain rate. If you damage your head faster than the pineal gland can repair,
Okay.
or you render your damage in such a way that there is no way to repair.
Okay. Well, I was like, what?
So listen to your wife when she tells you not to do something.
I got nothing. I got nothing. I got nothing. I started to say something, and then I was afraid. Is she watching? Is she here?
Yes. Okay, so
There is.
So here's the thing, though. Descartes is living in a Christian society. Well, for the most part. It's kind of split. Remember, Germany is Protestant Lutheran, and France is Roman Catholic. Huguenots, they keep trying to wipe out down in the south, right? And there are Jewish communities, of course, in the Netherlands too, as we'll see with Spinoza. But Galileo was just threatened because he believed the Earth goes around the sun, and he had to compromise his beliefs and say he withdrew that, right? And still got house arrest, right? And so Descartes is afraid of getting in trouble. And if you say there is no soul, that could be a burning offense, right? No one wants to be burned at the stake. So my suspicion is that, unlike Hobbes, who, by the way, clearly doesn't think there's a soul, he thinks the whole thing is just a complete physical machine. And by the way, they write letters to one another, right? Their correspondence through Father Moussain. Maybe met one another occasionally in Paris, because Hobbes had been there, etc. But I'm suspicious that Descartes only comes up with this concept of the mind-body dualism, which doesn't work. In fact, it's referred to as Descartes' error by Antonio Damasio. So Descartes' error, thinking that there's a dualism, right? So as far as lots of another Gilbert Ryle argued that this is the ghost in the machine. So that's where that phrase comes from, the ghost in the machine. Plus you get the argument of the homunculus. So, so the soul or the mind seems to sit in the pineal gland like a pilot in a great big robot and watches and sees and decides and drives the robot, kind of thing. But then the question comes up, well, how does the soul know? And so they come up with, oh, there's a homunculus in that. And then another one, and another one, and another, no, that doesn't work.
It quickly becomes turtles all the way down. Right?
It's turtles all the way down, young man, yes. Okay, but so that's a problem. Plus, it's like the quadriplegic in a car that's a stick shift with no. I know they're inventing things that enable a person to drive today with just the mind, maybe. But you get the idea. I can't do anything because I don't have arms. So how does a soul, a mind that's totally abstract, interact with a physical body? Can't happen. My suspicion is that he wasn't a mind-body dualist. He just threw some things in there about the mind to cover its bases.
But when you be burned at the stake.
Right, but when you look at what's motivating and everything, it's all mechanical. One of the things he made was his daughter Francine had died. I think she was only 5. He was very upset. He made a model robot of her. It scared people to death because it was a machine. It moved and had eyes and stuff. And I think it looked like Chucky. And so it scared people and they killed it. So this is pretty weird stuff. My quiz question then is: do you think Descartes was a mind-body dualist, or not? So maybe you could do some research to see what people say. Obviously, A.C. Grayling writes about Descartes in a way that I think has done more research on Descartes, and he obviously thinks he was a dualist. I just think Descartes was smarter than that.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, do you think Descartes was a mind-body dualist or not? In a way, if you follow the tradition and you're taking, the graduate record exam in philosophy, the answer is yes. Don't let me screw up your chances of getting into law school or something, right? And so the official answer is yes, he's a dualist. And there's interaction between them, and that's like impossible. There's no explanation for how that works. But that's perfectly good Roman Catholic thinking. Bless you. Which is Roman Catholic, too. Okay. So, part 2 of tonight's class. Sorry it's so late. Moving on, talking about Richard Rorty's article, Love and Money. And the video link, sorry it was in, I think it's Dutch. Anybody figure it out? But it was an interview, I think by Dutch TV, of Richard Rorty, but a lot of it was in English, so hopefully you didn't mind all the interesting reminiscing. But it's an interesting video about Rorty because it gets into his childhood and things of that sort. I thought that was pretty good. Did I have the link? That's the link I have, right? Talking about the right thing. Did I get so far?
No, you're on the wrong page.
I'm in the wrong thing, sorry. Yeah, so Love and Money. Richard Word.
If you write anything on your computer, you need to get Grammarly.
I write pretty much all day.
That it is sufficient consolation. On the other hand, I'm not sure anything else is either. And so I guess I think of such things as coming closer. Man,
As close as you can come to within conservation.
well, I think such experiences are as close as I can imagine to finding consolation in the world for the pain in the world. Okay.
So, the article that so Richard Rorty's one of my favorites. He did die. He's in his 70s. But he's still on my list, even though he's relatively dead. Completely dead.
I'm not dead. Yes,
not
you
mostly
are.
dead. He's not just mostly dead. He's completely dead. But
Oh, that was a Monty Python reference.
both of them, yes. Sorry, multiple. Besides, so Bill Cosby at 90% and the Monty Python 10%. So yeah, you know where I'm from.
Perhaps the Princess Bride.
And yet I can remember everything from the 60s, which is not supposed to be the case. They say if you live through the 60s, you don't remember them, but it's not true. I remember the 60s. It was all language philosophy for me. No, it wasn't. Not yet.
I had
So
some-
the article starts off talking about Howard's End. Anybody read the book? E.M. Forster? There's a movie too.
Sounds familiar.
You seen the movie? The movie's supposedly pretty good. Let me take this back so I don't lose that. But
Somebody was telling me once about a book that they thought was really great about the 60s that was really like the next best thing to being there, really showed what it was like. And so I had to ask them, oh yeah, what happens when you lick the pages? Anyone?
what happens when you lick the page?
Yeah. No one?
Are these the ones with poison on the edges?
Well, that depends if LSD is a part of it.
Will you come with me to Howard's End?
That's not really Howard. That's a fiction. But there is a real house that they used in the movie. It's interesting because it's in the same area that C.S. Lewis thought was like heaven.
We have here a note purporting to be in your mother's handwriting. I would like Miss Schlegel, Margaret, to have Howard's End.
And two ladies talking of love.
No, we were continuing a serious discussion.
I could scratch that woman's eyes out.
Why, but isn't Henry? Aren't you going to say hello?
No, Mrs. Burton.
No, I don't.
It's just you and me.
Don't take up a sentimental attitude over the poor. See that she doesn't, Margaret. The poor are poor, one is sorry for them, but there it is.
Everything's got spoiled for you,
Appropriate
hasn't
line
it?
in the trailer for
You have had a mistress. I forgave you. My sister has a lover. You drive her from the house. Why can you not be honest for once in your life and say to yourself, what Helen has done, I have done?
So, both the book and the movie are terrible.
You don't say. I wouldn't have guessed that at all.
They're the kind of movie my wife would absolutely love, and the book she would love, and I would hate. You know, so, because our tastes are different. my tastes are good, and her tastes are good too, but they're totally different. So that's, you know, kind of. But the reason I bring it up, of course, is because he reflects on this. And there's three main families: the poor ones, the wealthy ones, and the ones that are rich enough, but they're also very liberal and think society should help the poor. So the book is one of these kind of books that my wife loves, where all these different integrated, you know, characters are having relationships, and you know, I hate it, right? And she loves it because of the exact same reason I hate it. You know, that's the, you know, we are opposites that way. Wonderful, you know, that you have that sort of thing. She's read all of Jane Austen, all of the Bronte sisters, not just Charlotte, but all of the Bronte sisters, Charles Dickens, all of them, even the ones she hates. You know, she reads through it so that she's read it. Oh well. Whereas I like Kant and Hegel and things of that sort, which she never reads.
And I just can't understand Hegel.
Warum nicht? So here's the thing. In this book, we have the conflict between those who are wealthy and don't want to help the poor, those who are wealthy enough to be educated enough to feel that society should help the poor, and the poor, who, by the way, in the book don't get helped, just so you know, right?
You are just ruining everything for us today.
There you go, saving you money. Yeah.
Not quite enough yet to pay for the textbook, but
well, so
sure
here we are living in a
movies.
society, and by the way, at the moment we have a Republican president who is so dynamically trying to transform our society. If you think of it as a pendulum, right, and the pendulum had just recently been way over here. Notice, to me, this is the left side. We have Obama pushing the pendulum up here, and then that seems to have caused the pendulum to go all the way over here. So if you look at society as kind of a dialectical back and forth, society rebounded from the left, and now they're over to the right. We have them dialoguing over pulling things away. Just today,
but when you're driving and you go into a skid, if you overcorrect, you still crash. I'm just saying.
Actually, I'm not sure. Well, I won't find anything that I'm specifically thinking of. Not clear in my mind. I mean, pulling money away from all of the Great Society programs, which, by the way, I'm very fond of myself. So that's kind of interesting. I'm fond of them because I participate. Number one, I get Social Security, because I'm starting at 66. I put in for Social Security, so I get Social Security. Also, I have my military pension, so that's great.
Well earned.
I never was in danger, but you know, it's the way it goes, right? Plus, of course, my parents, you know, when they were alive, they were on Medicare. And in fact, even though I have a military medical program, it's actually also we pay Medicare, but we go to Elmendorf. So those are all Great Society programs that you certainly could say, well, I'm not paying for all of that now, I'm receiving. of that. You might say, of course, I sacrificed those years, you know, that I paid into it or that I served, etc. But those are all the kinds of programs that the current Republicans are trying to withdraw from, because those are the expenses that cost the government the most. Of course, you simply argue that they've arranged it so that there's a deficit by giving more money to the things that they feel they ought to, especially the military. I'm fine with that, actually. But at the same time, they also pulled the taxes away from the wealthy. So they're pulling the tax away that funds all of that, and then claiming that, well, it's now a problem because of these benefits that are being paid out from the declining tax revenue. Right? Everybody's familiar with all this? It's not my fault?
Not really.
You're not familiar with it?
Well, I mean, I'm familiar with the claims, but I think they're a little hyperbolic. For instance, the 83% that Nancy Pelosi talks about giving tax breaks to the so-called wealthy, if you look at it, a lot of those tax breaks translate into IRA, retirement holdings, retirement wealth, some $25 trillion worth across the United States. So I don't know that the tax breaks, which translate into bigger company profits, necessarily correlate to tax breaks for the wealthy per se. It's actually tax breaks for middle America in a sense, because that money is being translated into IRAs. So, I mean, there's a lot of undefined propaganda going on, and like you're saying, it's to swish, it's to swish the pendulum one way or the other.
Well, let me bring up Thomas Piketty. This book came out, what, 2017? That's the paperback. It came out early in the summer that year, and I think either 2017 or 2016. It's a bestseller for good reason.
All politics and all news is just propaganda because it has inherent bias to it.
Well,
so if you're only getting news from one source, you're not really getting news, you're just getting propaganda.
We have interpretation, so theories. Some theories are better than others. We have true statements. We kind of need to vote on those, right? Because they're true only within a linguistic context, so we have to have fluent speakers that know what we're talking about. We understand one another. We know, remember the problem of the bat. Do you understand a bat? Do I understand you when you say things? I mean, obviously there's a certain success that we have in understanding one another, or we wouldn't be doing very well. But we are. We're doing very well. It's amazing, in fact. So we do understand one another fairly well in some context. So we can have true statements, and we know that's true, and false. But then we have interpretations, and interpretations can be better or worse. So we, you know, if a typical literature thing, if I'm analyzing the Iliad or the Odyssey, I can have all kinds of interpretations. Some of them seem based pretty well on the text, other ones seem a little less, they're more wishy-washy. But strictly speaking, a teacher really can't say you're wrong, because it's an interpretation. You know, we actually don't know what the author was really thinking, or as you suggested with the Iliad, you know, maybe these were symbolic things that, you know, the colors were kind of a code, and we don't understand the code. I can't say that's false, because of course it's an interpretation, right?
I was just speculating on one possible explanation for the unusually restricted range of colors.
Right, yeah.
Might have been artificially and purposely.
But the thing is, what we can't deny is that in the Greek there are those three colors, right? Maybe, and yellow, I think, shows up occasionally, right? You can actually count that, right? So there are facts that are true or false. Then it's the interpretations of those then that we can disagree with and feel that there's better or worse interpretations.
All right, but follow this logic stream, and if all humans have their own prejudices and biases, for better or worse, and if all news and all politics is created by humans, then all news and all politics has some amount of bias to it. Therefore, if you get news only from one source, then you are getting that biased perspective and not having another differentially biased
The
perspective.
answer to that, though, is that you look at multiple sources.
Right. So my point there for what I say is that if you only get your news from one source, then you're
Agreed.
not really getting news, you're getting propaganda.
Well, you're still getting news.
I think these days, even if you get multiple sources, they're all owned by the same people.
Well, you can.
That's an
You
excellent
can
point.
go to
And
the
you see that with
Russian.
the Associated Press. Like when the Associated Press, like when you're reading a newspaper, right? Or you're looking online, you know, at like NSN.com or whatever, right? And they have an article and it says Associated Press, right? Well, that one article generated by the Associated Press has been distributed out to all those different venues, right?
People
So
no
you're
longer see
seeing
the
the
United
same
States as a
information
reliable partner.
presented
That's
as
according to a
different- if
new
it was
poll,
different from
which
different
suggests
people,
a
but it's
deeply
still
entrapped in transatlantic.
Here's the Russian news.
Well, that's despite what many have dubbed the romance between President Macron and Trump. Auntie Charlotte Dubensky picks up the
By the way,
story.
you can also get French news.
It was a rendezvous
BBC?
in the city of love that cemented
Japanese?
a new brooding relationship.
What other news?
Jazeera?
Two world leaders,
I mean, you can get
French
news.
and the odd whisper.
Al Jazeera, yeah, all these different news. By the way, I don't know why no one's trying to sue them for trying to influence the elections, because after all, that's what they're doing, is trying to do that.
All countries that are active in international.
Everybody's trying to influence you.
Everybody else's elections.
Previously,
We do it to
Athens
other
20
countries.
Macron
We
had
do.
cozied up
All the
to
time.
Trump, making a beeline for him
By the way,
during the
this
family
is
photo.
in
All
English,
other
of course,
leaders
did you
looked
notice?
on
So
in
who's the target
astonishment,
audience?
but since those
Us.
first intimate
Right.
moments, it seems the
But
relationship
you can also
has
listen to it in
somewhat.
Russian and so on. Yeah,
It's
and
way
so-
better in Russian.
So,
But whether or not Russia, meddled in our election, or to what degree they meddled in our election, putting that
never going to
aside,
solve. Even if they
everybody
did
does
it, I don't see
We
why
do
it's
it.
an issue.
The United States
Everybody tries to
actively
screw with
influence
the elections.
throughout the world.
Because it's illegal for a foreign entity to buy advertising, which they did through Facebook, that's why.
And England did too, but we didn't get all
Right.
upset with that.
Yeah. And that's another thing with
Actually, they
the FISA,
did.
with the FISA courts. It's called foreign intelligence surveillance, so we basically dig into the English foreign intelligence surveillance who are allowed to spy on Americans to get our American spies.
Right, so we basically, if I understand you correctly, basically the US government subcontracts out spying on its citizens to allied governments.
Yes.
That way, it's like, we're not doing it, they're doing it.
Exactly.
But,
But
potato,
in an effort
tomato,
of
tomato, tomato.
cooperation. Yep.
Well, that's why, in my
So-
personal opinion, and I take great risk in saying this, especially, outside, I think Snowden should be given a pardon and brought back to the States.
So here's Thomas
Everybody
Piketty
deserves a part.
trying to speak English.
So it's very nice to be here tonight. So I've been
Which is
working
difficult
on the
for him
history
because he's
of
French.
income and wealth distribution for the past 15 years, and one of the interesting lessons
Author of the book,
coming
Capital
from
and the
this historical
21st
evidence is
century.
indeed that in the long
Which,
run,
yes, is a
there is a
pun on
tendency
Karl
for the rate
Marx's
of return
magnum
of
opus,
capital to exceed
Das
the economy's growth
Kapital,
rate.
right?
And this tends to lead to high concentration of wealth, not infinite concentration of wealth, but the higher the gap between R and G and the higher the level of inequality of wealth towards the society tends to converge. So this is the key force that I'm going to talk about today. But let me say right away that this is not the only.
Just so you can see, you can get the, so I can ruin the book for you by
Go
just
ahead.
showing you this 20-minute video.
No, I actually.
But
I have
I'll
a very-
I'll ruin the 20-minute video for you by giving you the basic summary that says, all the so-called middle class that we had that developed in the United States, especially, right? occurred after World War I or World War II. The reason it happened was because the wealthy had their wealth pretty much crushed by the war and the follow-up war, right? And as a result of the United States being the main country that was rebuilding all the others, we had lots of income, lots of jobs. In fact, a lot of people that never worked before, the wives, also ended up with jobs, and as a result you had double incomes, and so we had the establishment of a middle class that never existed before usually. I mean, you know, it's based on his,
certainly not
his
to
data.
the scale.
Well, it's. I think, you know, he's trying to say this is like a novelty, right? And it happened basically from the 1950 thereabouts till 1990, and at that point, then the system, you know, of course, Japan and Germany were rebuilt, France rebuilt. They came back online industrially, competing with us. Of course, since then we've got China too. You know, so there's lots of world competition, plus. The wealthy now are building their wealth again. And we're at a point where growth has slowed down. And a lot of what built all of that middle class was the growth, right? You know, where the jobs came from. In fact, I grew up thinking that unless there was growth, you weren't going to have, you know, the economy sustaining itself, because you constantly needed growth. That's part of the, also the wealth redistribution packages, is that they're concentrated on the idea that you know, the amount of workers are always going to be more than the people retired, and we're actually in a situation where that's flipping, right? So basically, then he's arguing that the growth has slowed down. Roughly around 3% will be probably the new constant. And so the only way that you're going, well,
this was 2015.
That's pretty close. But so the only way you can make wealth now is by having wealth and investing it. So what's going to happen is things are going to go back into what he argues is the norm, where you have the very wealthy that own that top, you know, that it's really not even 1%. It's a fraction of the top 1%, and everybody else. That's where the economy is going to go. And these, of course, are people that have the power over lots of capital, because capital tends to accumulate itself and grow. So that's the sad news. But the good news, he argues, is the result that has on everyone and our dissatisfaction with it, because we don't have the kind of wealth that we imagine we would like to have, etc., can be fixed by wealth redistribution by the state. So socialism, right? Not communism, of course, because communism as a socialist point of view has been, everyone agrees, it's been demonstrated as absolutely not a success. Right? But so the end result is, what we need is the society to tax the wealthy and redistribute it among those, so that we have kind of at least some kind of minimum income. The only problem is that since the wealthy are the ones in charge of the government, and they seem to be dedicated to making sure that they keep accumulating more wealth instead of sharing it with everyone else, that might not happen. Comments?
I have 3 thoughts.
You're right to me so far. Just
You think he's about right? We should probably come up with a good quiz question based on this, because we've only got about 10 minutes, right? Do you think
Like I
Thomas
said,
Piketty is right?
Okay, so
Thomas
the first
Piketty
question
right?
is
Thomas Piketty.
No, he is not. And it would.
You have to at least watch his video. He'll give you some graphs.
I'm familiar with these issues quite a bit. I actually own a copy of the Communist Manifesto, and I own a copy of Mao Zedong's Little Red Book, which, by the way, was very
That was
difficult
from
to obtain.
1860?
Mao Zedong's Little Red Book? No.
No, the Communist Manifesto.
Is, got my phone.
You've got it in your phone.
No, but-
I own it all too, it's on YouTube.
Most importantly, the United States Constitution in Article 4, Section 4 actually specifies that one of the roles of the federal government is to ensure and guarantee to each of the several states a Republican form of government. Now, when they say Republican form of government, they're not referring to the party. They're referring to specifically not pure democracy, not socialism. So basically, bottom
But if
line
you have
is
the
that
wealthy
socialism is
paying
illegal
for
and
those that are
unconstitutional in the
running,
United
so
States.
that regardless of which candidate runs. By the way, which candidate do you think is going to be governor in Alaska at the next election? We have three, right? Dunleavy, who's being funded by his brother, and was funded well and early, right? We have our current governor, Walker, Malott, right?
They committed political suicide
Byron
with the PhD.
Malott. Sorry, I've always had trouble with his name. It's Malott, sorry. He has corrected me, so that's kind of interesting. And his son, one of his sons. Oh.
Just wanted to point out,
Well, in any
socialism is
case,
illegal in this
and
country.
then we have the person who my father-in-law always used to refer to as Big Itch. Mayor Begich, Senator Begich, Mark, right? However, he's going to be competing with Bill Walker. So the statistics seem to indicate that Dunleavy will absolutely win.
Yeah.
And Dunleavy is a Republican that says the way we solve the problem is we cut everything. But he refuses to say what we're going to cut.
It does get
Which is
difficult when you start
terrible, too.
running
One
out
of
of
my
other
colleagues
people's money.
thinks he's going to close the university.
No.
That's very unlikely, but I would welcome that actually.
He ain't gonna
You
close
wouldn't
you.
have a forum to speak.
I'm okay with that.
The mistake I think we're making is that we're not looking at new revenue sources. That's the biggest thing.
Government never ever has a income problem. It always has a spending problem.
Well, they have a big income problem, that's the thing. If we're only relying on
That was a
oil
no.
for Alaska's budget, then that's pretty bad.
George
Because oil's
Washington
gonna
thought
go
they
down.
had a problem making money.
I think they have a problem printing money. If we print too much money, that drives down the value.
Well, yeah, Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
Venezuela, Turkey, lots of examples of that.
And now since we printed too
That's
much.
another
through
awesome success of
quantitative
socialist paradise, socialist workers' paradise, Venezuela, where people are starving and eating their pets right now.
You know, most of the European Union works up for the socialist ideas.
I've lived there, I'm familiar with the issues, and I'm very, very passionate about it, and I hate that crap. I hate it bad.
Which crap do you hate?
Socialism,
Socialism.
communism,
What,
socialism.
I mean, Social Security? Not socialism?
Should not
Hasta la
exist.
Vegas?
Should not
Hasta
exist.
Vidania? Choose?
Social,
Sayonara?
Social Security should be your own Social Security, that each
So,
individual has.
Social Security is where the government takes money from me by force, and then maybe, just maybe, if I live long enough, I get a tiny fraction of it back. How about you just let me keep my money in the first place and I'll do with it as I please? How about that? Social Security is a form of socialism, and it's a
Well,
Ponzi
you know, when
scheme,
FDR
and it's illegal under,
was
socialism is
encouraged to do that
illegal,
by-
and it's
what
in our
was her name?
constitution.
Anybody remember the name of the woman that suggested Social Security? Actually, it goes back to the Prussians. They were the ones that.
I'm familiar with it.
I'm happy with it because, actually, I wouldn't be making enough money to thrive. If I were
Maybe
just
if you had all the money that they took from you by force against your will back and
does
had
not
invested
even
it,
come
that would
close
be.
to how much they've been giving me ever since. I've been being paid for my service in the Army for way longer than I was in the Army.
So they're trying to take.
That's a separate
that's
issue
like-
from Social
like,
Security.
They're trying to take your military retirement? Is that what you said they're?
No.
One
That's
of
a
the
benefit.
programs
That's a
they're cutting?
benefit They don't say that. I suspect that they'll get in a lot of trouble with their own supporters if they started to doing that. But they are actually trying to cut back on, the veterans care. That's been in trouble for years. Trump actually seems to be fighting against his own Republican Party and trying to make sure that that is funded. So that's interesting. There's a lot of things that Trump has been trying to do that's actually more liberal.
Liberal in a lot of ways.
Some of the more conservative Republicans.
They have actually torn apart the military retirement system. It's no longer a
oh yeah, they've
20-year
already
retirement.
decreased it.
It's actually just a
for the new
401k now. So the military retirement went from the 20-year system that you are currently under to now what I'm under is just 401k. And they do like a 4% match, and that's it. So, yeah, awesome.
By the way, if you start pulling that out before you're 70 and a half, there's a penalty.
Major penalties.
Which means that when you retire from the Army and you're given your 401k back, you can't actually live off of that.
You cannot use it, yeah. And the whole entire reason of that basically is to punish you for living too long, basically. Because if you live too long, it would be more expensive. But now why am I being penalized for pulling money out of my 401k earlier when it's my money in the first place?
That's the way they set it up.
Yeah, well, that's
what
horrible
a
and wrong.
401ks you could invest in without having been in the military or anything else. Anyone, you can
Right,
start
but what I'm
your
saying
own
is they took
401k.
away the traditional military style retirement. The retirement system that you are currently using doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
It's now just a 401k.
Nor do pensions. Most places no longer have the pensions that the previous generations had.
But when they tell me that
it was built on the idea that there would always be more workers because of growth.
Right. But what I'm saying is, if
But when
they're
they started
saying that my
realizing,
retirement's going to be
we're
self-funded now,
stable,
why do they
you've
care
got-
when I take my money out?
Instead of 10 people supporting the one retired person, now we're down to 3 people supporting the one retired person. That's predicted to eventually be 2, and then even 1 to 1. And, so basically, you can't have your son or grandson out there working their butts off, and the income that they're making, they have to split with one other adult who is retired now.
But that's a perfect example of why the entire Social Security scam is a giant Ponzi scheme.
It was.
It is. Which, by the way, Ponzi schemes are illegal. Unless you're the government, then it's okay.
Right. It's not my fault. But it could
Happy
seem
thoughts, everyone.
depressing.
Happy
It
thoughts.
could be depressing.
Enjoy your weekend. Yay.
By the way, John Ryan was on today talking about the real problem with our deficit was all of these benefits that we're paying out.
Well, like I said, you can never give away enough free stuff to make everyone happy. And the more free stuff you give away, the more free stuff people want and expect. And the more free stuff you give away, the harder it is to stop. And then eventually you run out of money.